common criticism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the quotas that are often associated with it, is that it involves discriminating against one group of individuals in favour of another group. And it can involve lowering standards for the preferred group of people, making it easier for them to get jobs or to get promotions, at the cost and the disadvantage and the discrimination of the people that aren't so favoured. However, despite many people arguing that this is likely to be the case, it begs the question of what exactly does the evidence show? Well, of course, the answer would depend on how we define diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI for short. If DEI is defined as considering all people on their own individual merits, regardless of race, religion, gender, or other characteristics, then clearly standards would not be lowered, because individuals would be considered as individuals in an unbiased manner. In this case, DEI would be defined as de-biasing the whole process. However, DEI is generally not practiced in that manner. Rather, DEI is practiced by advantaging one group of individuals at the cost of another. It involves discrimination, and while it is painted as positive discrimination, or painted as creating equity, so to speak, it does clearly create discrimination. Universities have reportedly been one of the biggest proponents of such DEI hiring, attempting to select people for their identity characteristics. Now, some universities are more overt about this than others. With some universities, it's clandestine, but with others, such as the Queensland University of Technology, it has become much more overt, the Vice-Chancellor seemingly indicating that they would not focus on merit when hiring. Rather, they would focus on identity characteristics. Seemingly, QUT didn't realise this would be, on the face of it, illegal and violate the Fair Work Act. Nevertheless, organisations that are more covert might still be able to get away with this type of thing. However, leaving aside the legality for the moment, it does beg the question of whether such quotas and such actions would actually lower standards overall, and would give an easy pass to the favoured group. So with this in mind, we've got some recent evidence. We've got some research, courtesy of an Indigenous-focused charity, the Close the Gap Foundation. They looked at whether this type of affirmative action could in fact lower standards and enable some Indigenous academics to get ahead, even though they seemingly didn't meet the hurdles that everyone else would have to face. Now, to be clear here, the Close the Gap Research Foundation is hardly an alt-right organisation. They state that they are, quote, committed to creating evidence-based programs and services that make a lasting impact on the lives of Aboriginal people in need. They also state that they, quote, aim to close the gap and make a positive impact on the lives of Aboriginal people facing adversity. This organisation is trying to help Indigenous Australians. The committee has many Indigenous Australians on it. This is not some far-right organisation that is trying to poke holes in affirmative action just to prove a point. So it begs the question of what exactly did they find? Well, what they did is they focused on universities, in part because what happens in universities can impact what happens with graduates. They focused on senior academics at these universities, so associate professors and professors. They identified 118 Aboriginal identifying academics, which they identified based on the public information from those academics. They then selected 118 similar non-Indigenous academics that were of the same job level, job function, research field, and the like. The goal here was to do a bit of a matched sample analysis. You've got a so-called treatment group being the Aboriginal identifying academics, and the control group being the other academics. They then looked at whether the Aboriginal academics were seemingly held to lower standards relative to the other academics, or whether they had an easier path to promotion. And it turns out that seems to have been the case, at least according to this research paper. And there were several key findings. First, if we focus on the highest level of education that these senior academics had, we have some telling findings. A senior academic should normally have a PhD or equivalent, given the job function in question. This is the case even if they are focused on teaching or administrative functions. Now, the research paper finds that 86% of senior Aboriginal academics had a PhD. By contrast, 95% of the non-Indigenous academics in the control group have one. Now, they couldn't identify in some people whether or not they had a PhD, but nevertheless it appears that Indigenous academics were less required to have the highest qualification in order to get these senior academic appointments. The second thing was years to appointment from the PhD. Now, ordinarily in any organisation, you need to do some years of work before you get promoted. The amount of time it takes depends on your outputs and the like. However, if you are promoted early, there is clearly an advantage, because a promotion comes with more money, so if only for that reason, being promoted is generally advantageous. So for non-Aboriginal academics, the time to appointment from PhD was 12.5 years for these senior academics. For Indigenous academics, it was 6.1 years, about half the time of the non-Indigenous academics. In essence, they were seemingly fast-tracked to the senior levels of academia. Now, of course, one reason for this could be if they were more productive, if they produced more research papers that were of higher quality, in which case one would and should get promoted earlier. And this then leads to the issue of production and outputs. Now, the research paper looked at a couple of things here, but one of the main ones was they just looked at the number of publications. Now, to be very clear, quality should not be confused with quantity. People can pump out many hundreds of papers that are of very low quality. It would be better to have just a handful of high quality, high impact papers than a truckload of bad quality papers. Nevertheless, it is a little bit indicative, assuming that paper quality is consistent across Indigenous and non-Indigenous academics, it is at least somewhat telling. So if we look at the associate professors, Aboriginal associate professors had published 14 papers before their appointment level. By contrast, non-Indigenous ones had published 33. If we shift through to the professors, the gap becomes even wider. So Indigenous professors had published 19 academic papers before their level of appointment, and non-Indigenous academics had published 55, more than twice the number of academic papers. Now, as I've indicated, quantity is not the same as quality, but it is certainly an indicator. Now, if we focus on research quality, there are several ways of doing this. Now, the research in question analysed this by looking at the H-index of the authors. They argued that it was not really feasible to look at some of the more time-based and time-varying measures, and therefore they just looked at the H-index of the authors at a point in time. Now, the H-index is somewhat informative. It basically tells us how many papers has the academic published that have been cited at least H times. So, for example, say the academic has 9 papers that have been cited 9 times, the H-index would be 9. Say an academic had 15 papers, but all of those papers had only been cited 9 times, then the H-index would still be 9. The idea here is to try to get at how well cited and therefore how well respected is the research. Now, there are some caveats with this data, but nevertheless, what they find is that Indigenous academics had an average H-index of 9. Non-Indigenous academics had an average H-index of 20. Clearly, therefore, at least according to that metric, the non-Indigenous academics were significantly better cited and had published more papers overall. So when we put this together, it looks like the Indigenous academics were held to a lower standard. They were promoted earlier, they were less likely to require a PhD, they had fewer publications, and they appeared to be less well cited, suggesting potentially a discrepancy in the standards being applied to different types of candidates, potentially because the universities particularly wanted to have senior Indigenous academics. Therefore, they would give them an easier way to get through to these higher levels. Now, to be very clear here, there are many highly qualified Indigenous academics. Many Indigenous academics do deserve to get promoted and have succeeded. And I'm sure that there are many Indigenous academics who actually have been held back and should have been promoted when they were not promoted. The issue here is that individuals need to be considered on their own merits. So the Indigenous academics who are great and got promoted, well, they should have gotten promoted. The Indigenous academics that have been burdened by racism and have been unable to get promoted because of that racism, well, that's a bad outcome. They should not have been discriminated against in that manner. Rather, they should be assessed on their own individual merits, much like everyone else should be. Now, of course, we should note that these results do have some issues. For example, the decision to undertake a matching procedure and to match Indigenous to non-Indigenous academics in the manner that it was done is not ideal. For example, they had 118 Indigenous academics here, and they got 118 control non-Indigenous academics. What they really should have done is they should have gotten data for all academics and then did a matching procedure to filter things down based on myriad covariates that exist, such as age, research field, gender, etc. They didn't really do that. It would have been improved if they did. The paper or the research findings could also benefit from additional econometric robustness tests. However, as a first glance, these results are at least interesting. They're informative and they are illustrative. And the results are so stark that it appears unlikely they were purely spurious, although I will note that some caveats might be necessary about these results. They are overall, however, rather troubling. If universities abandon merit, then what does this tell graduates, and what does this mean for the corporations those graduates ultimately work at? Furthermore, one has to wonder about how this is going to affect the talent pool the universities have access to. If, for example, non-Indigenous academics are held back due to trying to achieve quotas, then those non-Indigenous academics will simply leave. The ones that have viable outside options will go and take those viable outside options up, and the universities will be left with the academics that maybe aren't quite as good. This is the net result of applying quotas. Or the academics that stay are simply going to quiet quit, realizing that there's no point trying hard because the university is going to discriminate against them anyway. This is the net result of quotas and the net result of bias and discrimination. And universities, chief amongst organizations, should be avoiding bias and discrimination and should be assessing individuals based on their own individual merits. But do let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below.